this computer. There we go. So I just wanted to welcome everyone for being here tonight. We had a pretty good turnout for this event. We are still planning on virtual events throughout the rest of the year. We were hoping maybe November we might be able to do an in-person one, but the venues that we usually have still have their lockdown policies. So VSP and Blue Shield mostly were the conference rooms we were using. So we're not going to have an event in June. We usually don't for summer break. And again, in December for Christmas, we don't have an event. So our next event will be Wednesday, July 21st, again at 5:30. And Mai Kim from VSP, she's going to be talking about the business analyst role in user acceptance testing. She did that presentation last year and it went over really well. We had a lot of people interested in hearing that one again. So that'll be a good event. We should have information out probably end of June, early July for registration. Nora had some job opportunity information and I don't know how to unmute people. So let me just jump to this next slide. I'll come back to the agenda. Experis is looking to hire. So I'll just read this for if you're looking for work or know anyone looking for work. Experis has a lot of great opportunities. She actually is meeting with somebody tomorrow that they're helping to find a new job. So they have direct hire, contract work available, all kinds of opportunities here. So just reach out to Nora if you want more information, more details, or have any job opportunities to share with them that they can share on. So everything that's on this slide, including her contact information, I'll put in the chat here in just a few minutes, so you have that information. Like I said, we are recording this. I'll have the slides and the recording on the sacramento.iiba.org website on the resources section. We keep all of our history of events there, slides, videos, agendas, that sort of thing. And we'll come back to the agenda. You can get 1.5 CDUs for attending this. The CDUs are for continuing development units. If you're already IIBA certified, you can go download this agenda from the website, so you have a tracking for your CDUs. Let's see. And we'll go ahead and welcome Mahender. Let me get a quick, here we go. So Mahender works at Blue Shield. He's a PMP, CSM, CSPO, ACP, all kinds of initials under his name. Maybe he can share what some of those are. But he's going to talk to us tonight about the key attributes of making a good user story. So we'll do Q&A at the end. Maybe by then I'll figure out how to unmute people, but feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat and I can just read those off at the end during our Q&A session. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Mahender.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, all right. So a little bit introductions and then I'll share my presentation. So I'm excited to be here. So I'm passionate about agile transformations, and over the years, I've worn multiple hats, done different things within IT. For 2 years at Blue Shield, I was a Scrum Master. So there are a lot of folks from Blue Shield on the call. So worked with great people. And so I think this discussion today, it will be not so much as what a user story is, but more about what user story is not, and what are some real life experiences on writing some user stories, and what are some challenges. So I will share my perspective, and I would love to hear from the audience what has worked, what has not worked, what has been their challenges. So I think that's really where I see the true value in today's discussion and presentation. And definitely, I will share with some of the challenges that over the 2 years leading a large team, being a Scrum Master, what are some of the challenges that I had to face. So writing user stories can definitely be a change for people who have functioned in a traditional waterfall model. Um, what I'm hoping is that the audience can at least walk away with one actionable item. So if you look at what a user story is and what you can implement going back to your work or in your surroundings or environment, even if it's one thing that you're able to take as an actionable item, to me, that's success. There's nothing I'm going to tell you here except for few things that you may not have heard of. Everybody has seen what a user story is, how to write one. So for the most audience, it's going to be, yes, seen that, done that, been there. But I think the value in today's discussion would be at the end, if I can get your comments and feedback and questions, so that will generate some discussion and some, brainstorming and good ideas. So that's what I'm hoping to get out, and I hope you get some actionable items that you can go take it back to your team. So let me share my screen here. Can you let me know if you can see my screen, Steve?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So today's discussion broke it into few components. So we're going to focus on these items: who, what, why, and how. So different areas within the user story: who writes stories, who are they written for, what makes a story, what are the formats. We've heard all about the themes, initiative, epics, and user stories. So we will go into some examples and see what do they really mean. What are some of the key attributes of a good user story? And one of the common things when people write user stories is they say, make sure you go through the 3 C's. And so we will discuss what those 3 C's are: card, conversation, and confirmation. What is acceptance criteria? And we'll look through some examples that will highlight what the user acceptance criteria needs to be. What are some of the advantages? What are some of the different types of stories? And here's a key part: what user stories are not. So a lot of times I have seen some examples of user stories where you start wondering, is it really a user story or is it a stretch? So we will go through that. What is the difference between an acceptance criteria and definition of done? What is the format for acceptance criteria? Why should we write user stories? Why user stories are vertically sliced versus horizontally sliced? And then we get into the how. How do we size the user story? How to get perspective on story sizing, and how to determine who is right with the story sizing. How do you measure effectiveness, quality of user stories? So those are some of the items we will cover, and I'm hoping it generates more of a conversation that at the tail end we can discuss and do some takeaways. So let's go to the first one, which is what are user stories? So the key item here is it's a planning instrument or container for capturing business value. And the user story is always written from an end user perspective or customer. And in my mind, one of the key items with the user story, and this is where I have seen some of the user stories fail, is it's really a promise for a conversation. So when a conversation does not happen, so take an example of a product owner bringing a user story to the Scrum team. The team looks at the story, and the story is written so detailed, everything is in there, and they review the story, and at the end they says, let's size the story. The team sizes the story, and that's the end of the conversation. Guess what happens? When that story gets pulled into a sprint, Now the team starts asking questions, and that's when the conversation starts. And we really need to shift that conversation early on versus late in the game. So story is really a promise of a conversation. So that is a really key essential component for a user story. It is clear and concise, so everybody can understand. It outlines success criteria, which is the acceptance criteria. And again, this has to be part of the conversation. So at the time of grooming, the product owner brings the story to the team. We look at the story and review the acceptance criteria and see, does it make sense? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to enhance it? Do we need to change those acceptance criteria? The stories, they serve as a foundation for the project scope, estimate, and planning. So in a nutshell, this is what constitutes user story. Let's go to the next slide. So here are the 3 C's, the card, conversation, and confirmation. So the card says, give a 10,000 foot level need. So written on a card or in a tool, and may annotate with notes. And I think once we go through this example, it will become crystal clear. The conversation is where we get into what is needed, necessary, and the confirmation will determine whether the acceptance criteria have been identified what that is, and that would define that the story has been correctly implemented or developed. So let's take the example we have here, and I think this will really drive the point. So as a spouse, I want a clean garage so that I can park my car and not trip on my way to the door. All right, makes sense. Now, this is when the conversation starts. What does that really mean? What about the bikes? Oh yeah, hang the bikes. And so everything in the garage is up for conversation at this point. Now, the confirmation is what will constitute that the story is completed? What is the acceptance criteria? So the tools have been put away, items on the floor have been returned to the proper shelf, bikes have been hung. So just imagine if all we had was a card and we did not have a conversation and a confirmation. One could go and clean the garage all they want, but if they didn't do the 2 or 3 things, then the acceptance criteria would not have been met in that situation. So I think that really drives the point, is that 3 C's, the card, the conversation, and confirmation, those are the 3 key elements for writing a user story. Okay, moving along. The user story format, I think we've all seen this. This is the most common user story format. So as a user, I want to get an activity done so that it delivers a certain business value. And what that really equates to is who, what, and why. So if the story is written keeping focus on who, what, why, at a high level, that story will deliver as a user what they want and what is the ultimate business value. And again, keep in mind, it's a container that captures the business value. So here are some examples. As a driver, I want to limit the amount of money before I fuel so that I can control my expenditure. As a driver, I want to get the receipt after fueling so that I can expense the purchase. As a finance department, we want to print receipts only for drivers who request them so that we save on paper. Now, when you read that, there's so many other questions that come to your mind, and that's when we start getting into the conversation and coming up with the acceptance criteria. Okay. Moving right along. So a good user story has these attributes, these 6 attributes, and they're normally referred to as INVEST. You might have seen these. And so I would love to get everybody's feedback and input into what are some of the challenges with writing some of the good user stories? What are the challenging attributes? So let's go through each one of them one by one. So the story needs to be independent. It can be freely reordered in the backlog, but every once in a while, there could be some stories that have a dependency on something or the other. So which should be an exception to the rule. And that would limit the story from being moved from one sprint to the other. So, but in generally speaking, the story should be fairly independent. Negotiable. A story is a promise of conversation. I think that was the key highlight I was referring to. In this conversation, the team negotiates the solution, enhances or rewrites the story. This is one area that I have seen that there's not enough conversation that happens when that story is being delivered by the product owner to the team. So this is a key attribute. Each story adds value to the end user or customer, so that part of the story. So here I want to ask and get people's feedback and ask the question, what happens with technical stories? Can technical stories be written where you can provide a business value? And that becomes the challenge. So later on in my presentation, I'll walk you through some of the technical stories. And that's when it gets a little difficult to follow this format. If you're making database changes and it's truly a technical story, how do you convert that story into something that's valuable for the business user? So we'll go through those examples too, but that's where this valuable part becomes a little challenging. A story needs to be estimatable. I have seen stories that comes to the team and the team is not able to estimate. Well, this is the perfect time for the product owner and the business analyst or whoever on the team has written that story to take that story and maybe create a spike story. A spike story is a story that requires further analysis and investigation. And that analysis and investigation will then lead into enough information where the team should be able to take that story and estimate. And if the estimated story is way too big, then the team will have to look at options of breaking it into smaller chunks. The story needs to be small enough. It needs to be small enough that the story can be pulled within a sprint. And if it's not small enough, then the team needs to look at the option of breaking that story into smaller pieces. The story needs to be testable. So the acceptance criteria should be able to drive a test plan for each of the stories. Otherwise, it will be hard to confirm that the story is done. So invest is something you will see everywhere that you look for what a user story is and what are some of the key attributes. So I would love to hear from folks on the call is what are their challenges when it comes to following some of these attributes? Where is that it becomes really difficult? Moving right along, who writes the user stories? So anybody can write a user story. It's a collaborative effort. Team members contribute to the acceptance criteria. So all the team members on the team have the opportunity to write the story. But one of the primary responsibility of the product owner is epic and story writing. Some product owners will ask BSA, BAs to assist with this job. But at the end of the day, every team member can write the story. Now, here's a caveat. If the BSA and the product owners are only the two people writing the stories, it will create an artificial dependency. So going back to what a good user story is, it's a conversation. It's an inclusive thing that everybody needs to participate in, not only looking at what that story is, but also contributing to that story. So the product owner is responsible for ensuring that there is a quality backlog. So essentially, anybody on the team can write user story, with the primary responsibility being the product owners and the BA. Who are the stories written for? User stories. User story is written for team members from a user perspective. Anyone on the team can write story, with the product owner managing the backlog. Okay, moving right along. So here is something you might have heard of frequently. The words that are themes, initiative, epics, and user stories. So let's talk about what a theme is. Theme is a collection of user stories from different epics. So a theme could be an epic by itself, which is a collection of stories, or it could be a combination of stories that are across different epics. And so let's take an example. So if an airline company comes up with the theme and says the theme is safety first. So all the epics and the stories that works towards that objective of achieving safety first could be theme X. So you get my point, what a theme constitutes. Initiatives are collections of epics. So if initiative comes within a company and says, we've got a funding for such and such initiative, then the team looks at that initiative and starts breaking down into epics, and each of the epics then are further broken down into user stories. And a user story captures the who, what, and why from a user perspective. A user story is simply something of value that a user wants. Going back to one of our previous slides, story and epics are terms we use to help simplify discussion within the Scrum team. So now let's look at an example, and I think that example will highlight what each one of these are. So moving right along, we have an epic that says buy a plane ticket. And within that epic, there are different themes. So the first theme could be flight search. And the flight search could include search by city, by date, by price, by the complex or the advanced search. Shopping cart would include credit card, online, PO, purchase. Then there's a checkout theme, which is travel insurance, in-flight entertainment. And then fulfillment would be electronic ticket, paper ticket. And then there could be another theme, which is after the sale is done, what would a what would a traveler want to do? Maybe refunds, same day exchange, different day exchange, different city exchange. So you get the idea of how different themes, different epics, and different stories, they work together. Okay, moving right along. What is an acceptance criteria? So this is what we talked about a while back. So one of the key things about the acceptance criteria is that you look at the user story, and let's look at the example first, and I think that'll drive the point. So let's say we have a user story that says, as a user, I want to enter a strong password when creating my account so that I can keep it safe and secure. So there's a lot going on here. And if you really look at it, what would make a strong password? This is when we start breaking it down into the acceptance criteria. So following are the acceptance criteria, which will ensure that this story, at the end of the day, the product owner will say, I will accept this story because it met all these acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria expresses the condition that needs to be satisfied for the customer. It provides context for the team. How does the team know when the story is done? Acceptance criteria are written by product owner and refined by the conversation with the team. So here is another area that the team needs to really focus on and have a conversation about the acceptance criteria. And do that early in the process and not late in the game. That way, we are able to create good user stories. And this is specifically done during the backlog grooming. User acceptance test scenarios are a good starting point for acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria provides the details of the story from a testing development sign-off point of view. So really key critical component of writing a user story is having good acceptance criteria. And developing those user acceptance criteria in a team setting. Let's look at some formats on what the acceptance criteria look like. So test that criteria or demonstrate this happens, verify that a role does some action, they get this result. Given a context, when this event occurs, then this happens. So these are all different formats that product owner, team members can interact, engage, and come up with the acceptance criteria. Moving right along, what are the advantages of an acceptance criteria? It helps solidifies expectations for the story. It continue the conversation between product owner and the team. This is where there's a huge value when there's a negotiation, trade-offs, and options to split a large story into smaller stories. Because as soon as you get into the acceptance criteria, you start thinking about the solution and what it'll require to say this story is done. And oftentimes during these conversations, the team comes to the conclusion, you know what, we need to break the story into two components, or the story is too large. Establish a high-level test plan, provides a basis for the solution design and approval. So this is when the conversation also starts about the solution. The team starts thinking about how to provide the solution to this user story. All right. So what are the different types of user stories? So far we talked a lot about what are the functional stories. So within the functional stories, they highlight the role of the user and it identifies and provides the business value. But let's talk about the technical stories. And I have seen a lot of technical stories. So oftentimes people will discourage having technical stories or keep it down to a minimum. But there are oftentimes you need to introduce a technical story into the project. So what are technical stories? They often lack clear user perspective, behavior, or business value. And we'll go through some of the examples, and I think that'll resonate with you. So example of a technical story. So I've got 3 stories written here, and they are going in the order where the last story is probably the best one that's written from a user story perspective. So the first one is call the backend service from the native apps. As a developer, I want to configure Jenkins so that we have continuous integration. Now, here's a story that does not provide you specifics on what actually needs to happen from a technical perspective, but there's probably a lot of technical work that needs to be done, which could be captured within the story. So as a user, I want the website performance to be improved without affecting its behavior, so I can continue to use it as I expect it to behave. So you see the story, it's very nicely written, but it's a technical story. And the details will be coming within the story what that technical work may constitute. So what are the different types of technical stories? So the technical stories, which are generally non-functional, can be related to product infrastructure. So if a new or a modified infrastructure is there to support the functional story, then this story is created to bring that body of work within the team. The team may have a need to get some tools, testing, metrics, design, some of this stuff, which would result in buying and installing software. So this could be another story that would have to come in within the team. The refactoring I have seen often, and I'm sure you've heard about this one too. When the developer says the code is really bad, we need to rewrite the code, that's why we're having problems. And so the first question as a product owner and a scrum master, one has to ask is, what are we talking about? What is the effort? And what are you going to do? So if that work is brought into a sprint, that's purely technical story. It's not providing any value. It's very hard to justify and write what the business value is. But in some instances, it's a necessary thing because in future, there's a lot of gains for redoing that story. So refactoring is really restructuring an existing body of code, altering its internal structures without changing its external behavior. So this I see often. The team will bring in this kind of refactoring. If there are a bunch of bug fixing, and there's a cluster or bugs that are within a piece of code, sometimes they would be lumped together and create a technical story to repair time or reduce aggregate of testing time. So that's something also I've seen. This is fairly common. A technical story is a spike story. So in instance where there's a spike story, this is generally when there's not enough information that we know about a user story. There's a lot of unknowns, there's more analysis, more research necessary. This is when the team creates a spike story. So it involves doing some research. There is some learning involved. There might be some architecture, design, prototype, and ultimately a set of stories and execution strategy that will meet the functional goals. So the spike story will enable and assist with other stories so that the team can look at those other stories and properly groom and size it. And those are some of the spike stories that team has to create as part of doing some analysis. Okay, moving right along. So this is another area I would love to hear from everybody. What user stories are not. So user stories are not detailed requirements. I have heard from folks where teams have taken a business requirements document, a BRD, and just attached it to the story and said, I've already created a story. Well, that is not a story. Story is a conversation. It has to have business value. The more details you have in a user story, there's a lack of conversation that gets to that point. So it really inhibits creativity, boxes the team. So this is a really key important point is don't make sure that the story is not very detailed. A user story is not a solution. User story represents a problem to solve instead of solution to deliver. A user story is not a task or tasks. It actually has a picture behind them, which only the people involved in the conversation can see. Now, a user story can spawn multiple tasks, and that's okay, but it's not a task by itself. Use cases. User story focuses on value or results versus use case is a set of interaction that includes user behavior and system response. That's a key thing to keep in mind. Screen mockups. Attaching a screen mockup to a user story is okay. Sometimes it's needed, it's necessary. But a screen mockup by itself is not a user story. Same thing with UML diagram. UML visually represents a system with its main actor, roles, actions, artifacts, or classes. But the key is we don't see the value there within the UML diagram. So UML diagram by itself is not a user story. Documents and identifying system attributes, again, none of this constitutes a user story by itself. Okay. All right, moving right along. We've heard these two words often. What's acceptance criteria and what's definition of done? Acceptance criteria pertains to each story. For each story, it specifies what is necessary for that story to be completed. Definition of done is a shared understanding on what it takes to make your product increment releasable. So for one specific story, we look at the acceptance criteria, but across the board, if we have to look at all the user stories, the definition of done identifies what is necessary to make all those user stories be completed. So the key difference is definition of done is common for all the user stories, whereas acceptance criteria is specific to each user story. Okay, moving right along. Why write user stories? User stories help reveal what to code, why, and ultimately deliver value. Okay, so let's talk about how do we size user stories? And user story sizing, and a lot of us have used the story points, it's a relative metrics. And what a story point represents, it represents a complexity, risk, and effort. And sometimes it also has to be independent and also ask the question, do we have enough knowledge about the story? So these are some of the attributes that have to be kept in mind while sizing a story. So story point does not equate to hours, days, or weeks. And we often get into trouble there. People will ask, okay, so it's an 8 story point. How many hours are we talking about? And that's not what it represents. And we'll go through some examples that will highlight how story points are so relative, and it can be different for different people as well as different for different teams. Teams should never compare points. All teams are different. And this is where we get into trouble. And I've seen that people try to measure the metrics and say this team has a velocity of 80 points, this one's doing 120 points, so this team is working at an optimal pace versus the other. So one should not get into that area of comparing the story points from team to team. Large stories are okay, especially when there is a lot of uncertainty, but they should be broken down before being pulled into a sprint. So the more uncertainty you have, the story point can be higher, but as we know more and more about the story, then those story points can start coming down. Okay, that cake looks really good right now. So let's talk about what does a vertical slicing and a horizontal slicing mean. So think about a cake. And if different layers of the cake represents user interface, services, domain, and databases. So if we were to be presented with a cake and we had an option to eat, most of us would say, slice it vertically because we're not a 5-year-old that wants the frosting. But if it had to be sliced horizontally, then the question is, what value does it represent in terms of a user story? Because in terms of a user story, if all we did was the database work, the value component disappears. It's very hard to write a user story and say, oh, in this sprint, we did database work. In the next sprint, we did user interface work. So vertical slicing of a user story is an agile approach to creating individual pieces of system which provides incremental delivery, gain business value, consistent feedback loop, responding to change, and build team understanding. Now, I will admit that sometimes this can be challenging. So I was on the team and there was one instance where the environments were down. So none of this stuff was working, services, domains, databases. So the team had the option to take within that sprint stories that focused on nothing but user interface. And so the stories were not done, but for that specific sprint, the team worked on developing user interfaces. So it's almost like saying we don't have a frosting, but you'll have to live with eating one layer of this cake. So ideally, the stories need to be sliced vertically. There needs to be a distinct value that gets delivered when that cake is served. Make sense? Okay, so now let's get into this example. And I think this example will really drive the point about when it comes to story sizing. Why is it so relative and so different from team to team and person to person? So imagine two friends talking. The first one says, hey, do you want to go mountain biking? Second one says, sure, I would love to go together. The first one says, I know this cool trail A, it takes just 30 minutes. Friend two says, awesome, which trail? A? Friend one says, the one at the edge of Thomas and Greer. Friend two says, I know that one, but it takes me 60 minutes. Friend one says, I've been there many times and it always takes me between 28 to 32 minutes. So you see right here, two people talking, takes them different amount of time, same trail, but they could have different bikes or they could have different ability to ride the bike. So friend one says, I've been there many times, 28 to 32 minutes. Friend two says, I've been there too almost every month and it takes me 55 to 65 minutes. Friend one, yep, I know it's pretty tough. It is for sure a 5 mile long. Friend two says, yes, it is 5 miles. So there's an agreement here that the distance of that trail is 5 miles, but it still takes different timing for friend one versus friend two. So tough is an understatement, steep incline, sharp curves, etc. So the discussion goes on between the two friends. So now the big question is, who is right? How long does it take? So let's go to the next slide. So the moral of the story is there's a difference between the size of the effort and the speed at which it can be done. So what they agreed on was it's a 5 mile trail. What was different was how much time it took. So by the same token, sizing depends on so many things. So within a team, a skill set, condition, experience, external factors, tool, and even how people are feeling. If people are exhausted, they're overburdened, they're going to size that story really large. But if they're feeling good, they might size it small. So it's relative. So, and I can guarantee you, if you took a story A to one team, they could come up with one sizing, and there's a good chance if you took the same story to another team, that sizing could be different. So this was a perfect example of why that could happen. So let's take another example here. So we have three trails. Trail A, 5 miles, Trail B, 8 miles, Trail C, 3 miles. So all different distances. So both the friends, they agreed that Trail A is 5 miles and is relatively tough. So they create a relative size of 3. So now we're getting into the story sizing, story pointing. So Trail A has been determined to be 3 points. Then they go and relatively size the effort for the other trails. So they just look at the distance and they said, okay, so if Trail A is 3 points, then we will go with sizing the other two stories, and C is the shortest, A is the second, and B is the next. So they decide to size it as 3, 5, 1. So 5 is the 8 mile trail, 3 is the 5 mile, and 1 is the 3 mile. So far, so good. But then after biking these trails, they learned that Trail B is very flat and straight, which happens to be the biggest trail. So it is a lot easier than originally thought based on the learned information. So distance became not as important because this was a flat trail. And so now, because they learned something new, the relative sizing of those trails changed. So now trail A is 3 points and B became 2 points, even though that's the longest trail, and C is 1 point. So you get the point. The more information you have, there are a lot of factors that come into the picture when sizing a user story. So I would love to hear your experience, comments, feedback on how this exercise goes with your team. So how to determine who is right with the story sizing. Story sizing estimations are meant to improve over time as team learns more and more and have historical reference data to consult. So this is one of those things that gets better with time. Metrics, real data like cycle time helps to inform team the relationship between size and time. Who sizes the story? Dev, QA, responsible for sizing within the team. Okay, so we're almost there. So what is the one of the biggest problem that a user story addresses? If I have to pick just one, I would say it's the miscommunication. So the communication is at the core when writing user stories. And so that is probably one of the biggest benefits that the user story provides. So at this point, I would like to open it up for questions, comments, feedback to the audience. So Steve, is there anything?
So I do have a lot of questions and comments here in the chat. So I'll just start reading through. Some of the comments are relative to slides earlier. The first question I got was, is a spike story created only when a given user story is not estimatable, or if the user story does not satisfy even one of the attributes?
Could be both. So if the user story does not have enough information for team to start doing sizing, and there's too many unknowns. Unknown is the key word in my mind. So the more you know about the story, the less the team struggles with coming up with acceptance criteria and knowing what to do. So that's really the key, is if there are unknowns, that's when you need a spike story.
Okay, and Terry Wetzel said, there's a couple comments and a question. I find it difficult to make stories independent and small enough to work in one sprint because there are dependencies that must be done prior. How are themes identified in stories that are part of the theme? I'm familiar with labels, but don't think this is what you're referring to. Can sprints be organized by themes?
It sounds like there's several questions in there. So first of all, if the story is large and it can't be broken into a sprint, it cannot be accommodated within a sprint, then the team needs to look at it. There's always a possibility of doing small increments, small chunks. So that's a team conversation I would encourage team has. You can build partial functionality and make sure it's testable, it's working tested software, and then take the next component of that within the next sprint and make it working testing software and then deploy it. So I think I answered partial question. What was the other piece, Steve, within that question?
Can sprints be organized by themes?
Can sprints be organized by themes? Yes, they can be. Again, that's a decision and call that the product owner has to make. Generally speaking, they're looking at the highest value. What is the highest priority? What is the highest value within the backlog? And so it's really product owner who makes that decision. They can pick all the stories that surrounds a certain theme, or they can pick it based on a certain epic. So it's their decision.
Okay, Brian Melville asked, do you always write the acceptance criteria when the story is written? Couldn't it change by the time it's actually assigned to a sprint?
So ideally speaking, the acceptance criteria are written when the story is created, but it is subject to conversation, and it's likely to change when you bring it into a grooming session. So within the grooming session, the team members, they put their head together, they start understanding what the story is, what is necessary, what's needed. And that's when they start refining and adding additional information to the acceptance criteria. They may tweak acceptance criteria, they may add additional acceptance criteria, but that's when that conversation during the grooming helps refines those acceptance criteria. I have seen that the story gets pulled into a sprint and some acceptance criteria may be tweaked within that sprint as well. That does happen. And that's the whole premise of working in an agile environment, is that change is welcome, but we should still try to address change as early in the process, not late in the game.
Okay, there was a comment to that question that said if your acceptance criteria changes, then you probably need to rewrite the story. Would you agree with that?
It could result into that in some instances, but generally your acceptance criteria should be looking at the story first and say, if this is the story, what should be my acceptance criteria? But yeah, I can see that happening. And then if that happens, then sometimes the team may have to reevaluate the story and resize it. So certainly because the team has added additional acceptance criteria, now the testing component just increases significantly. This is the time when team would say, you know what, I estimated this to be 8 story points, but now looking at what the acceptance criteria is, I think we need to change it to 13. So that does happen oftentimes.
Okay, I have one more comment and one more question. I've also figured out how to unmute people. So if you have a question you want to ask, you can just raise your hand and then I'll manually unmute people. Mike Katrib had a comment, the non-functional technical stories still need to be addressed with the business product owner. Otherwise, the business value may not be obtained. That I think is critical.
True. The business product owner has to, you have to get their buy-in and explain why that story is important. It is sometimes very difficult to articulate the true business value. And a lot of times the business value is very intrinsic. You're changing certain web services, database procedures. It's very hard to write and describe what that is. But that one example that I had was very generic about the web services and writing that technical story. And I think that story, as a user, I want the website performance to be improved without affecting its behavior so I can continue to use it as I expect it to behave. There's hardly any technical information in here, but it is most likely a user story. So the technical stories have to have product owners buy-in. The team will have to convince the product owner why it's important, and then a decision needs to be made. How many technical stories do you bring into a sprint at the same time while you have functional stories also within that sprint?
Okay. And Kevin Light, with the caveat that he's a PM, not a BA, said subtle changes and nuances are fine. Radical changes mean that you've missed the requirement.
Radical changes when it comes to technical or just functional? Technical stories or functional stories? So can you say that question again, Steve?
Yeah. So either technical or functional. So subtle changes and nuances are fine, but radical changes mean that you've missed the requirement.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Yeah.
And how about the definition of done? Is that done at the epic level?
So the definition of done is at a team level for most part. It's not release or epic or theme. So the team needs to decide before when they regroup, there are certain things that they have to bring all together. One is your working agreement. What is that team working agreement? What is the definition of done? And that definition of done then applies across all epics, all stories, all sprints. So it needs to be consistent, that's applicable throughout the Scrum ceremonies.
Okay, I have one more comment here. Unfortunately, when there are multiple Scrum teams, the number of user stories completed are always compared by the higher management team. The core concept of every team is different, is not really understood well by the higher ups.
True, true. And I've also seen that oftentimes, at the higher level, if there are multiple teams, they'll come up with graphs demonstrating, the team velocity, how is team performing, how many story points they're delivering. But the message here really is story points are different for every team. There are too many factors that come into the equation, and oftentimes there's a story behind the variation in the story points. So let's say if a team is consistently delivering 80 story points, and suddenly you see a drop, then that's the time when you start asking the question, what really happened? And so management, in my mind, instead of comparing the story points across multiple teams, should focus on the deviations and see how they can assist and ask those questions. What caused the story points to dip for this one team versus the other? Sometimes there's a dip across all the teams, and that may have a story behind it. Maybe the environments were challenging, something didn't work, and that's what caused the story points to dip. But that's always a difficult conversation when management tries to compare one team's story points to the other, and they should not.
So do you recommend any specific questions that should be asked during that conversation?
So during those conversations, I would say explain to the management what really is the story point. Again, story point does not equate to any specific quantitative measure. It's a combination of all those attributes: risk, effort, dependencies. And so every team has a different framework. Nobody defines what an 8 story point should be for all the teams. So there is no consistency. People are different, they're dealing with different situations. So it's probably more of an education, keep bringing that point up. And I think the real story is when there's a variation, that's when you tell the real story, is why do we see variation? And as long as the team is somewhat performing at a consistent level, if 80 story points is the average and they're in that vicinity, then that is the team average. And that's the message to the management I would communicate.
Okay. Next question, should the relative user story sizing be considered only for the stories within a sprint, or stories can be compared across sprints?
So what happens with the team is, as the team matures and you go through multiple sprints, the team becomes really good at sizing. And so in those situations, you develop a baseline. And I've often seen that there comes a point where during the grooming session, if there are 5 technical team members and you review that story and you ask all of them, you start seeing a consensus. You don't see the variation. If everybody is saying it's a 5-story point, you know that the team understands, the team is maturing. They now have a relative basis, a baseline for sizing it. But early on in the process, they're struggling. So, and that's what generates the conversation. If 3 people say it's a 5-story point and 2 people say no, it's 8 or 3, then that is the time to have the conversation and hear out the people who are the outliers and explain to the team why they think it's an 8-story point or a 3-story point. And maybe there is something behind there that other people need to understand. And then, you recalibrate and then come up with a consistent story point that everybody agrees to.
Okay, so Kevin asked again, from a project management perspective, you've just articulated half of the problems with Agile. At a management level, I don't really care how you're delivering. If you don't meet the dates you as a team have committed, then you've failed. So how would you address that?
So, okay, that's a good question. When it comes to delivering anything, we have to look at what is the body of work, what are you up against. So when it comes to Agile and traditional waterfall, even in Agile, you've got sprints, you've got a backlog, and you know the team's capacity. So regardless of what that date is, one has to look at the backlog and look at what the team has been able to do. So I was up against that last year. There was a date ahead of for my project, and we had a very healthy backlog. So the first focus was let the team focus on the backlog. Let's look at how many stories do we have, and we came up with there were 60 or 70 stories still there. We knew how many sprints we had. We knew what the team's capacity was, and we looked at historical information and said, what is the average size of the stories? So we extrapolated all that known information and then came up with the possibility that could we deliver this project in this time frame or not? And then you determine what is the confidence factor. So there's really not an easy way. You have to work backwards. So you got a due date, work backwards, see what the backlog is, what the team is capable of producing, and then you communicate to your stakeholders how realistic are those dates. So regardless of no matter what approach you take, whether it's Agile or waterfall, the key is evaluating your supply and demand. And so in Agile, you've got to look at your backlog, you've got to look at your team capacity, and that's the only way you can communicate to your stakeholders whether you can meet those timelines or deadlines. But the nice thing about following this cadence is that every sprint you're completing, you're able to deliver working tested software. So if you have a date, there's a chance that you may not be 100% done, but there's a good chance you may be 90% done, because so far you have completed 90% of the deliverables. Not sure if that answers the question, but that's always a challenge, coming up with the date and meeting the expectation. But you've got to do your homework, due diligence to make sure and focus on removing impediments. That's what a Scrum Master does. Every single sprint, just focus, focus, focus. Look what the roadblocks are, what the impediments are, how can we remove them. Being in a servant leader role, that's what they're there for.
Do you have a example of a definition of done that you can share?
Definition of done, I am sure I have for my project. It'll take me a few minutes to look through it. But basically, in a nutshell, what a definition of done needs to include is what all has to be met by the time a product owner says, yes, it's ready, I accept it. And there are multiple things that can be part of definition of done. But in nutshell, it needs to be a releasable piece of software. It should be ready to be released. Every other thing, every, dot the I's, cross the T's, everything needs to be taken care of and it's ready and it's in a releasable state. That would be definition of done. But that's a very simplistic view. The definition of done could be, make sure UAT is done, environment analysis is done, and you can come up with a long list of things that would constitute your definition of done. And so that way the team has an agreement. Okay, I have to make sure that these 5 or 10 things are taken care of, and the product owner has seen it, and the product owner has deemed it to be completed and its definition, and it's done. But I'll be happy to send the definition of done as an example to you, Steve, if you want to send it to folks later on.
Okay. Yeah, that's all I have for questions right now. There's a lot of good conversation in the chat that you didn't necessarily get to follow along with. I read as much as I could.
Okay.
So I think I'll send the whole chat transcript to you.
Okay.
And then if you want to maybe address any of the comments or questions, we can add them to the slide deck when we post it online tomorrow or the next day.
Would love to, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And I hope it was valuable for folks who were listening to the call. And those were some of the really good questions. And those are some of the challenges, I have faced too while running some of the Scrum teams. But the key to having good user stories is make sure it's a promise of a conversation. So a good user story promotes that. It's a conversation within the team. Make sure it's not super detailed, that it stops the conversations within the team. And if you can accomplish that, then you can meet the objective.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Mahinder, for presenting to us today. We're going to do a quick raffle. Let me stop the recording. We don't need to